for me, the excitement of being on the start line with a couple of thousand people watching in a car with 700 horsepower and weighs 500 kilos is like nothing else. It's like drag racing with corners. You absolutely can't sit on the line at Chelsea going, what if I understeer off at first corner, or if I've got oversteer? Because you just have to figure it out.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by professional racing driver Alex Summers. His specialty is actually hill climbing, and he's involved in the British Hill Climb Championship. In fact, he's won the whole thing outright. Now, from this side of the world, I don't get to obviously witness firsthand the British Hill Climb Championship, but, you know, I've got Instagram and YouTube, and you see some pretty insane machinery competing in this Hill Climb Championship. Talking to Alex, we actually find out that some of these cars are essentially Formula One cars, only maybe actually faster. Faster mainly because the rule set that they have to stick to is much, much more linear than what Formula One teams have to adhere to. So these cars obviously then are insanely fast. We talk about the development of these cars, the competitiveness in this type of racing, and also the mindset that is required in order to really be on from the second you leave the start line to the finish line. And this may take, as we'll find out, well under a minute. Certainly not something that I find very easy to do. Normally, I take a couple of laps to kind of feel my way into the car and get used to it. You just do not have that luxury when it comes to hill climbing. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Alex. Thanks for joining us. And as usual, let's start by finding out a little bit about your background. And from what I've seen, you're quite unique in that you're an engineer, a race driver. You do your own engine calibration and just about everything in between. But let's start with the basics. How do you develop an interest and passion for cars?
Yeah, I am very lucky to be from a family of, should we say, motorsport enthusiasts. My great-grandfather started hill climbing in the UK in the early 1920s. So I've just spent my whole childhood looking at pictures on the wall of racing cars. And really, for my whole childhood, there wasn't anything else that I wanted to do. My grandfather was quite a famous collector of cars, vintage stuff like Alfa Romeos and Maseratis and stuff like that. And that then, fed into my dad, who had his own specials. He had Austin Healey, things like that, and a thing called an MGKN special, which he sort of designed in his mind's eye. He didn't design it in the literal sense, but he took a road car and made a special, or sort of commissioned a special coach-built body for this thing. Completely stunning bit of design. And both my dad and my grandfather have got a real eye for, they've got a taste, an exceptional view for buying the right car. My dad has a historic F5000 car, which I know a big deal out in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And it's a Lola T140. It's the oldest one you can get. And he insisted on it being done absolutely as it should have been, so it's still on mags, carbs, anything that's not period. He's had designed in such a way that it looks period.
So he's made it worse, but more authentic.
It was made it as it was.
Yeah.
But throughout my childhood, my parents, so my mum didn't have an interest in cars before she met my dad, but my dad's one of their first dates was at a vintage sports car race in the UK.
How romantic.
Yeah, and my dad, being the kind of guy he was, he picked her up and took her around a paddock in a Type 59 Bugatti. He'll be screaming at the hi-fi, but it's something like that, right? And I think that was pretty much sold. So my mum is a hill climber as well, and an intrinsic part of my hill climbing and motorsport life. So most of the series I compete in, the British Hill Climb Championship, most of the rounds I actually share the car with my mum, which is
wow,
very cool. So I had no chance as a kid. It was going to be cars, but certainly for the first 10 years of my life, they weren't racing because me and my brother were expensive. They've not forgiven us for that. But yeah, so all the usual stuff in terms of driving. I started with a go-kart that my dad had made at work, and we sort of ripped around a bit of tarmac that we had access to. And then these things get a bit more serious. I was never really good enough to do proper karting, if that makes sense. I wasn't dedicated enough. I liked beer and playing drums and things like that. So I was interested and I could do it, but I never went like Super One or Rotax or anything like that. I just messed around.
On that note, because we've talked about karting as kind of a gateway to, obviously most of the Formula One drivers start in karts, and we've also talked about the fact that it's a cheapish form of motorsport, but I mean no form of motorsport is really cheap, and if you want to be competitive in karts, it gets very steep. But the point you just made there, the fact that you didn't kind of have the dedication and you like doing things outside of racing karts. What sort of hours in a kart per week would someone actually need to be spending in order to have a red hot crack at getting to the top step of Formula One? And I mean, granted here, there's a lot of other parts that go into it in terms of raw natural talent and obviously money. But how much time are you needing to spend in a kart to be really, really good?
Well, the time, and there's the engineering as well. So, my parents both worked, always, and still do. We would have had to take, during the season, you would be testing once, twice a week. I'm talking hypotheticals because we never did. And then you would arrive at the track and you might have a wet chassis, a wet weather chassis, a dry weather chassis. You might have a couple of spare engines. And you've either got, in motorsport, it's either going to take you a long time or it's going to cost a lot of money, right? So you've either got to do it yourself or you've got to pay someone else to do it. And we had neither the time nor the resources then to do both. So there's the driving element, which is circuit racing requires a huge amount of accuracy, repetition, and experience. And the more of that you pile in, the faster you'll be. It's pretty much a direct proportional relationship, right? So I think also my parents were quite conscious of the whole have a childhood versus motorsport, because I think young people don't necessarily work out what they want to do until they're, for example, 33, which is what I am now.
That's fair though.
So it was a thing that I did a couple of tests with Century Motorsport, who now run all sorts of things. And I think they said to my parents that, yes, but you're going to need to do this, you're going to need to do that, you're going to need to spend this, and I think that at that point I was doing lots of other things. I was being a kid, I was 10, 12, 13 years old, and there were experiences to be had. I played drums. I did a lot of drumming when I was a teenager, and the sacrifice was probably too much. But I mean, to get good at karting, you hear about people like Lewis Hamilton, Nico Rosberg. They go off. They would go off for weeks. Karting holidays, if you can call it that, week after week, lap after lap after lap. And I'm not putting it down. I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't. But
I think it just becomes an individual path that's maybe right for one and isn't necessarily right for another. I mean, one thing I think is a danger with that sort of dedication as well is obviously you need to be doing this from a young age if you want to have that chance at the upper echelons of motorsport. And I think at that point also inevitably schooling takes a back seat, which kind of becomes a bit of a risky bet, because if the motorsport thing doesn't work out, and let's be honest, it probably works out for 0.0001% of people to make a good paid employment from that as a life. If it doesn't work out, then you kind of have lost out on the education to fall back on, probably you haven't had the social experiences which you've just been talking about as well. So yeah, the whole thing kind of can implode. So yeah, I don't know. It's basically take it to the casino and put everything on red or black.
Precisely, yeah. I don't think I'd have done a lot differently. I think my parents were really honest in the best possible way with me about, you've got to pay bills, and you can't be putting it all, as you say, on red. And I learned fairly at a fairly young age. I think 18. I'd kind of got over my aspirations of being a professional musician, or indeed going into any kind of professional motorsport. Which is why I'm always surprised that now occasionally someone pays me to do it, which is lovely. But I kind of closed that door reasonably early on, and I went to do engineering. But around 16 years old, which is when you're legally allowed to start circuit racing in a big car, is when I started hill climbing, which is the sport that my family had always traditionally done. And then I started to kind of work up through that. It's very much an amateur sport, hill climbing, through and through. Sponsorship is rare. It's usually self-funded. And quite a lot of people do build their cars. People start in road cars. I started in a Formula Ford, which was a lovely 1980s Van Diemen thing with a stick shift and carbs, and which we've still got actually. And that was a gateway drug into single-seater race cars. Again, my family had always done historics, and this was even being a 1980s car was seen as a sort of modern. And and I then started to take it kind of more seriously throughout my early 20s, and then I first started doing the British Hill Climb Championship in earnest in 2011. The great thing about being at university is you get a 4-month long summer. You either develop a professional drinking habit, or you go and do something valuable, or as I got older, I got more and more into it. And now I think the British Hill Climb Championship is 15 weekends a year.
Wow.
Something like that, including the testing.
I mean, never having actually attended a round of the British Hill Climb Championship, because that's pretty difficult from New Zealand. I mean, from the outside looking in, you say it's sort of an amateur sport, but I mean, the cars involved at the pointy end, I mean, I'm guessing there's all manner of vehicles competing at all different levels, but the sort of at the top end, you see a lot of the wings and slick styles of cars. These are very, very serious cars, incredibly fast, requiring a lot of driver aptitude to actually get up a narrow, windy hill. So I think you've almost maybe downplayed the seriousness of the championship.
Well, if I did, I didn't mean to. I think when I say the word amateur, I simply mean that it's not a commercial. It's not like British touring cars, or
yeah, of course,
which my wife's involved with. She does marketing for one of the teams. It's very different lifestyle. We're either building it or we're funding ourselves. That doesn't mean if you look at the British Hill Climb Championship, and anyone who's not, I would encourage you to, because it's sort of the most open technical regulations that you can imagine. So take a 90s Grand Prix car, basically, and take all the fuel out of it, and take a lot of the weight out of it, and give it maximum send and big wings and so on. So Gould, which is the manufacturer that I won I won my only championship in a Gould. And they supply loads of parts in F1. They're a professional composites outfit. The Gould GR59, which is the car that's currently I have to try and beat every weekend. I don't drive a Gould anymore. I'm with DJ now, which is a similar concept, right? But these cars are built by professionals, F1, ex-F1 in a lot of cases, people like Martin Ogilvy, Willem Towett, who you probably heard of, chief aerodynamicist at Sauber for years and years. He designs the aerodynamics for one of the Empire, well, all of the Empires actually, which is another car brand.
Okay.
And he's doing Project Inversion, which you might have heard of. Driver 61 YouTube channel. He's going to try and drive a car upside down.
Oh.
So that is a British hill climb car. That's the Empire Wraith. So again, most of these cars are full carbon tubs, layups designed by people who design layups for Formula One cars. Most of the engines are either 90s F1 engines, 90s IndyCar engines, or early noughties Le Mans engines. They are enormously powerful. So the car I run, the DJ Firestorm, which is an absolute honey of a thing, it's got a 2.65 litre 1998 Cosworth IndyCar engine in. And for those of you who spend a lot of time on YouTube like me, you'll see there's a guy in America who's rebuilding a Cosworth XD IndyCar. It's an amazing bit of kit. It's basically a Formula One car, but a Formula One engine, but built to a spec and runs on methanol. So it's 15,000 RPM red line. It has 24 injectors for 8 cylinders to get the volume and precision of fuel in. and it makes something in a region of 600 to 700 horsepower, depending on how much bullshit you've drank that day. But it is an amazing series, the British Hill Climb Championship. It's so intense. And you've not just got single seaters, you've now got a thing called the Tin Top 10 Challenge. And I don't know if Tin Top is
it's a term we use as well.
Yeah, cool. So basically, amazing car and driver combinations. People like Damien Bradley and 800 horsepower Subaru Legacies and things like that. Self-built cars, SBR Chrono, which is built by a friend of mine, is basically the shape is like an Audi R8, but it's their own chassis.
So basically, anything and everything goes as long as it's got lots of power and not a lot of weight.
Yeah, exactly, and a lot of aerodynamics. So if you were to accidentally Google Gould GR59 or DJ Firestorm, you're probably thinking that I'm talking about like something quite basic. But if you do, what you'll see is basically a 90s Formula One car, or an early 2000s Formula One car, but a little bit shorter because of the lack of fuel.
Yeah. I literally just Googled the GR59 while you were talking, and yeah, this thing is no joke. So everyone else can do exactly the same.
So all of those cars, the Firestorm, which is my steed, the Gould, Pilbeam did a lot, Force, and so on. They're all exceptionally well built, well thought out, designed cars. There's a huge amount of technical expertise, and a lot of times people either retire from Formula One and do it, or it's like a side quest because there's a sort of curiosity about what could be done, which is, I think, from an aerodynamic point of view, and if you look into that and the ideas that gave it, concept, it was like, take all the rules away, what do you get? The only rules we have are sort of box templates for sizes of wings. We've got ride height rules, and there's a sort of rule about movable aero being outlawed. So when you look at these cars, they have a sort of disproportionately large amount of wing, but that's because the average speed on a British Hill Climb Championship run is 80, 90 mile an hour, and the top speed's 150 or thereabouts. So they're amazing. It's an amazing series. It's super competitive. We've got some really good drivers. So when I say the word amateur, I simply mean that it is a not-for-profit, done by people who have other things going on series. It's growing in popularity due to things like live streaming. There's a Hillclimb UK. They do a live stream of most of the events, which if you're interested, you can see runoffs and things like that. And yeah, a little bit outside coverage, things like what I'm doing with my social media and stuff, I think helps a little bit. Shelsley Walsh, which you've probably heard of, which is the oldest motorsport venue in the world, still running on its original course. That's one of the British Hill Climb Championship rounds. So yeah, it's an amazing thing to be a part of, and I thoroughly recommend anyone who's interested in tech or motorsport. You can see racing with no filter, or race cars with no filter.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about the aerodynamics there, and Formula One aerodynamicists being involved, everyone obviously knows that Formula One is the pinnacle of motorsport, the fastest cars. But the reality is that they are built to increasingly stringent rules in terms of what can and can't be done, particularly with the aerodynamic components and the shape of these components, where they can and can't be. So when you actually have an open rule set, there is a lot more that can be done over and above the performance of a current F1 car, which in and of itself is pretty mind-boggling. But of course, the FIA are trying to slow the cars down continually. The engineers are trying to find ways to undo all of that and make them faster. And then there's obviously safety and, just as importantly, the ability to actually have the cars follow without being disturbed by dirty air, and obviously allowing passing and racing. So anyway, I've got a lot more questions around hill climbing, but before we get into that, I want to sort of fill out your sort of life experience up to this point. So can we get into your sort of formal education and what you sort of did, which obviously your life was already predestined to be involved in motorsport thanks to granddad and your dad. I'm guessing that also drove your choice of vocation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like maths. I still don't. I was quite easily distracted from an academic point of view, but I think when the harsh reality of, if you want to be in engineering and you want to design stuff, it's part of it. So I remember when my maths teacher said you need to do maths A-level, I laughed. A-level is like the last college thing you can do in the UK. I laughed them out of the room. I said, no, that's not me. And they said, well, look, if you want to do these things you're talking about, you kind of need to do that. Fortunately, I'm happy to say 15 years later, that's not so much the case. There's a lot more apprenticeships and things now. There's a lot of other ways in, but whilst, I'm 33, it's actually a long time ago, when I started doing when I started thinking about all this. And it was a little bit more cookie cutter then. You want to do engineering, you need to do maths. If you want to do law, you've got to do history and so on and so forth. So yeah, I did maths and I did physics and I did chemistry, which is the kind of perfect combination of no social life and maximum application to engineering. I was very lucky to surround myself with people in that college setting, with people who pulled me on, or gave me influence. So there's a really famous rally driver in the UK, ex-rally driver called Andy Burton, who built a Peugeot Cosworth rally car 306 with a Cosworth KF DTM engine in the back. And I went to school with his son, and we would spend a lot of time nerding off. And he would say he was actually designing bits for his dad in SolidWorks or something. A very precocious guy, extremely talented to boot, just like his dad. And I met a few people. I hung around with a few people at college and school who actually were better than me at those things that I wanted to do. And I mean that in a non-toxic way. I aspired to be, able to do some of the things that he was already programming parts on a milling machine at the age of 16, which I thought was mind-blowing. So I had some really positive influences, both my age at school and from my family. People, my uncles both have worked in cars restorations and things like that. My aunt is she does cabinet making and sculpture and stuff like that. So there was a lot of good, positive career type influences. And fortunately, I didn't fall down some of the pitfalls that some people do when they kind of go to college. And when I left college, I went to university in a small town in the UK called Bath, which is a Roman town. It's very pretty. It's very small, and the university is relatively small. And I read engineering there. I did 2 years of a mechanical engineering degree, and I was really struggling. I'll level with you. I was on a 2-2, which is like a C or a D. It's one of those things where if you graduate with a 2-2, you struggle. You will struggle to get into those top companies.
What was the part that you were struggling with? Is it still kind of the math component, or is it a bit wider than that?
Yeah, it was maths, and it was also like a bit of a psychological thing where I think it's possible to be really nurtured through school and college, and then it's also possible to go to uni, and then the pressure just leaves, and they go, well, if you don't turn up to your lectures, I don't care.
It's a good point, actually. My university degree's a few years earlier than yours was, a little bit older. But I just, as you said that, I do remember, at school you'd kind of do get sort of force-fed along the way by the teachers and sort of dragged through. But yeah, as you say at university, hey, if you don't want to turn up to a lecture, that's on you. You're not going to pass. No one really cares, except for the people paying the bills, probably mum and dad.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think there's some really profound moments I can think about from my education where I would work on the things I enjoyed, structural mechanics and things like that, design. I never had a problem getting involved in that. And then the things I was bad at, I didn't work on. And without wishing to get too profound, if you want to get good at something, you need to focus on the bits you suck at, right? Not the bits you're good at. And I think when you're young, and I had, a huge ego, as a lot of young people do, and I thought, no, I'm going to be this and I'm going to do that, and it's all going to be great. And then you see the results in ink, and you go, oh shit,
this is not working out. There actually is no magic.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember after my second year, I rang my mum to say what results I'd got, and I'd said I got 52% average for the year. And she just said a wonderful thing. She just said, are you proud of that? Is that okay? And I obviously blabbed, go, oh, well, of course, it's all going to be fine. And then I thought, oh, fuck. And she was absolutely right. And my parents have never been pushy. They've never said, this is what you've got to do. And, they've just had a lovely way of impressing upon a little bit of accountability, shall we say.
I think most people, when they're younger, don't respond very well to being told what to do. But in a subtle way, if you can come to terms by yourself with what you need to do, that's a very different trajectory.
For sure. And I've always been really lucky to have a friendly relationship with my parents. And so I could identify with how they did and what journey they went on. And mum was always very candid about the fact that she didn't get the results at uni that she wanted to. And, it was based on her circumstances at the time. And a lot of university is patchy because I spent a lot of time drinking beer and doing stuff. But that was like a plunge pool moment. Holy shit, this is my life now. This is my career. And actually, whatever modicum of talent or good fortune I have is not going to do the business. It's not going to get it done. And this isn't me trying to sell you a course of some sort of major Instagram. This is how you get successful. This is just what I felt like. Oh God, But I was fortunate enough to get a placement at McLaren Automotive between my first, second, and then subsequently third year. So I did a year, 12 months with a good friend of mine from uni, and we shared a flat in Woking, and we worked on the McLaren MP4 12C and the P1. I can't say any more than that, obviously, but that's what we did. And he was a superb influence on me. He now runs a very successful fitness business, and he was very dedicated to his health, and he was also very dedicated to his work. He was very, this is work, this is training, we eat this, we do that. So without wishing to sort of drag that out, throughout the period of time I was on my placement, I was surrounded by really high value people. Obviously, everyone who works at a company like McLaren is super high value. And it brought me onto a level where by the end of that 12 months, I was doing a 50-hour week without even thinking about it. Going home, eating well, going to the gym, ringing my mates, doing all the life admin that life invariably requires. And when I went back to uni, I thought, what the fuck am I doing all these? I've got, I don't know, 10 hours of lectures a week. And then what? So I went from being kind of chaotic and reasonably good at some of it to being very regimented and working really hard on the things I sucked at.
I mean, even that placement that you've talked about there at McLaren, and I mean, I know obviously NDAs, we can't dive any deeper than that, which is absolutely fine, but I mean, the experience and opportunity that you've got being based in the UK, just Europe in general, you're not going to get that opportunity coming out of a university here in New Zealand or Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have any companies working at that level. Obviously, there's no Formula One teams based down here, and I think you probably maybe you don't even realise how fortunate you are to be in the location you were and have that experience thrown upon you.
I think I do now. I mean, one of the amazing things about social media that I've experienced since I started blogging about hill climbing and engineering and stuff is people will email me or DM me from Brazil, and they'll go, "Where do you get your composites?" I go, "Oh, you just go on this website," and they go, they don't have that here, and you go, oh, hang on a minute, and really with 8 of the Formula One team or 7 of the Formula One teams within 100 miles of my house, I don't know I'm born. I'm very, very lucky, and kids growing up in the UK and in Europe in general are very, very lucky with all of the big car companies that we have here.
And then by default, you also get the supporting companies making the componentry. So you've got easy access to all of that just up the road, essentially.
Yeah. And I think England, UK, we aren't very good at being patriotic generally. We're quite self-deprecating. You don't often hear English people saying nice things about England, but it is one of the things we do extremely well, high-end engineering.
I've never heard anyone speak positively about the weather, but that's about it.
Do you know what? It is actually 30 degrees. I am so sticky right now. I mean, you probably think that's nothing, but yeah, it's very, very hot here today. But most of the time, rain is actually sideways.
I must admit, we did visit Goodwood Festival of Speed back in 2019 before the world all changed, and I think I'd had one experience in the UK prior when I was maybe 12 or 13 with my family, so I didn't remember any of that, and I was braced for the worst, and we're in England for 2 weeks, and it was absolutely beautiful weather every single day we were there.
You must have brought it with you.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking to myself, what's everyone complaining about? This is perfect. If we could turn down the temperature 2 or 3 degrees, I'd actually be a bit more comfortable. But I digress.
We're gluttons for it. We love it. We're very cynical. I come from the Midlands, so it's very cynical around here. Do you know what I mean? But in terms of the opportunities you mentioned out in New Zealand and Australia, yeah, I'm ignorant really, and I think now you mention it, I guess you've got V8 Supercars, you've got things like that, but it's certainly not. I mean, we've got a different race series going on every 5 minutes here.
I mean, I think part of the problem with New Zealand, and to a lesser extent is in Australia, the countries are very small. We've only got 4.5 million people here in New Zealand, so there's no manufacturing base for the automotive industry here in New Zealand, and again, to a lesser extent, we could say pretty much the same for Australia. You mentioned the V8 Supercars series. I mean, that's the pinnacle, essentially, of professional motor racing in the Southern Hemisphere. And it is a very competitive class that has maintained a really good following. So, yeah, there's a trajectory for engineers to get into the supercars field. But, I mean, when you compare that to the upper echelons in Europe, F2, F3, F1, British touring cars kind of pales into, no, I wouldn't say insignificance, but it's just not quite there. But again, there's not the money there either, I think.
No, but it's interesting. There's some really high level Australian F1 drivers and things like that. I think people who really want it, I think you can make opportunity. I think it's easy for me to say, and you're probably screaming down the YouTube or whatever, going, "How dare you, you Englishman!" But there's companies like Rodin and stuff that are starting to come through in New Zealand, and obviously Motec, that I use a lot of their stuff as well. So if you really want to do something, you will find an outlet for it. It would be a sad thing to think that I've got to move to Europe to pursue this, but we are very lucky where I am, and I'll make no excuses for it. We really are.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just anecdotally as well, it's quite interesting. There is a path from, maybe from a driving perspective, there's now a proven path from supercars into, sort of the higher end forms of motorsport. We've got, I guess I'm a bit biased, but two of the Kiwis. We've got Shane Van Gisbergen, who moved from supercars to NASCAR for this season, and is getting some pretty good results in his rookie season. And then we've also got McLaughlin as well, who's in IndyCar and doing exceptionally well, Scott McLaughlin. So, there's definitely room for those drivers to move over into the US series, but obviously from an engineering perspective, you could probably say the same for their top engineers. There's probably room for a data engineer to get work on a GT3 team in Europe as well, I would imagine.
Sure.
Interestingly as well, just with that supercars series, there's been quite a few situations where drivers have come from other classes. James Hinchcliffe is one of the ones that sits in my mind. He, IndyCar driver, and he did a wildcard entry at the Bathurst 1000 endurance race. And obviously in his own right, a very experienced and capable driver, but seemingly found it quite difficult to adapt to the supercars chassis, being that it's got a reasonable amount of power, not a lot of tyre, it's pretty heavy, and by all accounts, incredibly difficult to drive.
Touring car championships, like the British Touring Car Championship, they endure by being aware of the spectacle rather than the technology. So if you look at Formula One, there's obviously a huge amount of commercial pressure to make the technology. The way that the commercial interest is steering engine regulations in Formula One and things like that. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because Formula One is the pinnacle of everything. But I'm a huge British touring car fan, and I have a huge amount of respect for the drivers in it, because the cars are very deliberately limited by regulation to protect the show and to let the drivers make the difference as much as good engineering can. So actually, what's really lovely about the touring car team that my wife's involved with, you've got the engineers get quite a lot of time on TV. They're quite famous people. They get awards at the end of the year. Antonio Carroza, who's someone I'm a huge admirer of, who does the engineering for Ash Sutton and Napa Racing. They are working on tenths, maybe even less, on everything. We changed the camber by 0.1 of a degree and it made this, and you think, wow. But if the cars are allowed to go down too complicated a thing, traction control, launch control, all that sort of stuff, then you're slowly removing the driver from those bits. And the V8 Supercars is very similar. If someone goes along and goes, let's put this new bit of technology in, and everyone goes, no, don't do it. What's wrong with a stick shift?
Yeah, exactly. They did have that argument for the new generation. They were looking at going paddle shift, and they've kept it. It is an analog series, zero driver aids. What you were saying as well about the spectacle, I think as a driver, as an engineer, we're all about how can we find another second? How can we drop a tenth even? What's easy to forget about, though, is the spectators don't know if the cars are doing, let's say, a 1 minute 32 lap time or a 1 minute 25 lap time. It really doesn't matter, and they don't care. What they want is close racing that's competitive. You want 10 cars to qualify within, half a second, ideally. So that's much more important than the outright lap time. However, we've got so far off track, I can't almost see our way back. Let's talk about what your sort of your day-to-day life looks like in terms of work once you got out of university with your degree.
The bit that was missing from the puzzle when I went back to uni, I also got involved in Formula Student, where I met a lot of really, really good people. I'm specialised in tyre testing, tyre dynos, and things like that. That was my thesis project. At which point I went and got a graduate job at Aston Martin, where I work now still.
How many years have you been there? Just sort of give us a bit of a sense of time frame.
10 years in September. So I'm just about out of the new guy label. But I went there as an engineering graduate. I can't say again too much about what I do, but I'm now a manager of one of the prototype workshops. But essentially, I went from uni, went and got a quote unquote normal job. I didn't go into Formula One. I didn't go into any kind of professional motorsport endeavors, but either from an engineering or driving point of view, because of the hill climbing, I needed to have some weekends. And one of the things I get asked a lot on Instagram is, why don't you work in Formula One if you like designing cars and doing stuff like that? I said, well, if I worked in Formula One, I wouldn't be able to do this. It's as simple as that. It's a 1-for-1 trade. It's either go and follow Formula One around 20 weekends here, or race my own car, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, obviously the Formula One season essentially runs across the British Hill Climb Championships Series season as well.
Across everything, across winter. I mean, they stop in December and they start in February. I mean, it's
never ending.
Well, I think the phrase would be a confidence lift for Christmas, and then back on the throttle in January. Do you know what I mean? It is a full-on lifestyle, and it's extremely tempting if you're based in the UK as an engineer. And I've got a lot of friends from uni who do Formula One, and I think it's one of those things you look back on and go, wow, what amazing, what a thing I was involved with. But I had to make a choice and have a work-life balance, which I really value, and be able to do my motorsport initially as a driver only, and now more as a sort of maybe a technical consultant, test driver for McMurtry, and also with my own projects. So the career is something that, again, I can't say too much about, but it's a very nice, very pleasant, very natural career progression through graduate engineer, senior engineer, leadership. And if they want me sweeping the floor, I'll do it. If they want me to go and design some rocket ship, I'll do that. But then when I'm racing, and there's very little overlap, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like you've kind of engineered where you are in your life to give you the financial resources and the free time that you need for what you wanted to be doing in your life, obviously. The hill climbing aspect, which is what we'll get into now. So I've already obviously touched on this briefly. I mean, it sounds really like, thanks to your family background, circuit racing was really never much of an option. It was always going to be hill climbing. Did you ever, sort of consider maybe bucking the trend a little bit and going circuit racing?
I have a big circuit racing itch that I will scratch one day. Grandpa did more than my dad did. The Vintage Sports Car Club was historically a multidiscipline club. It was a bunch of guys and girls who had cars, and one day they'd be doing a hill climb, and the next day they'd be doing a road rally, and then the next day they'd be doing Monaco Historic. And then I think when you pick your horse, as it were, if I did some hill climbing and some circuit racing, I'd be no good at either. I don't think. I do occasionally race the historic Lola, and I turn up and I think, oh, this is brilliant. I'd love to do this. And then I'm straight back and I go, actually, but I want to put a wing on it and I can't, and I want to do this and I can't, and I want to change that and I can't, and it's not powerful enough, and I'm getting beaten.
And you can't change anything.
Yeah, exactly.
It just is what it is.
I can't replace a talent deficit with more aero or more horsepower or something, which is kind of my hill climb career personified. So yeah, I very much want to do it, and I think when I've scratched the hill climbing itch, which I don't think I ever will fully, but when I really want to win, I won a championship fairly early on in my career. I landed on my feet with the right team and the right car. I'd love to do it again in something that I've either developed or had a hand in developing, or even designed, and that's still very much something I want to do. But yeah, I mean, maybe do some historic stuff later down the line. But hill climbing is all consuming, I think, at the moment.
From my, let's call it weekend warrior perspective, I find that if I'm circuit racing, which is primarily what I'm doing, There's one hill climb here locally that we compete at in a car that's absolutely completely unsuited to hill climbing, but we do it because we're a naming rights sponsor, so it's kind of nice to have the car there, and I'll admit it's a bit of fun. But where I'm going with this is, as a non-professional driver, I get out on the racetrack, even our local track, which I now know like the back of my hand. I've probably done 1,000+ laps there. I can't come out of pit lane and be on it. It's going to take me, 3 to 5 laps to kind of like, all right, I'm in the groove. Yep, the concentration level's there. Now I can push and actually do a half decent job of finding a lap time. That's a very different mentality to hill climb. Hill climb's almost a bit more like rally. The old saying, a rally driver sees, a circuit driver sees one corner 1,000 times, and the rally driver sees 1,000 corners one time. And it's a kind of a bit more like that with hill climb. Where I'm going with this long-winded discussion is, what's the difference in mentality, mindset, and focus to sort of extract a really good run when it might only be 45 to 90 seconds up a hill, and maybe I don't know what the British Hill Climb Championship runs like, but here in New Zealand for a hill climb, you're lucky if you get more than four runs up the hill.
Yeah, mindset would be the key thing. For me, the excitement of being on the start line with a couple of thousand people watching in a car with 700 horsepower and weighs 500 kilos is like nothing else. It's like drag racing with corners. It's totally the opposite end of, even rallying. I think you can go, okay, well, the car's understeering a bit, so okay, maybe I'll do this, or I'll I can work around that. Basically, in hill climbing, all your prep is front loaded, so we agonize about which tire, what wing angles, which launch and traction settings that we're going to use, and even down to things like where we go, what part of the start line we go off laterally across the line.
What's going to give you the most grip off the line?
Yeah, in the wet you avoid the rubber and things like that, but it's not a binary wet or dry thing. There's obviously a spectrum, particularly in the UK, all the time. And you can go into the first corner at Shelsley and you've lost the runoff, and you've got a bad launch, or you've let the revs too high on the launch, or you've done this and done that. So that pressure is what makes it so exciting for me. There was a runoff a few years ago that Sean Gould won at Shelsley Walsh, and he got the record, but 3 of us went beneath the record in that runoff. And Shelsley was a very hot day, very steep hill with a number of corners. The first corner is a slight lift at 107 mile an hour. Second corner is nearly full throttle at 130 mile an hour. Then there's a kink at 145 mile an hour, and then some S's, and then a finish line at 150. And it's 1,000 yards, and the vertical displacement is ridiculous. Sean Gould is Gould, right? It's his dad and he who run the concern, and he got the record down from a 22.5 to a 22.3. And I was last to go, and I'd watched him do this record, and everyone's like, right, mate, time to shine, off you go. And you just go, and it's almost like it has to be done on feel. You've done everything, you've obsessed about every tire pressure, spring rate, wing angle, whatever, and then you light the cannon and bang, off you go. And we're 0 to 60 in under 2, 0 to 100 in under 4. First corner, bang, like that, with no idea what's going to happen. And it's just, from a driver's point of view, there is nothing on earth, I think, that gives you that. And you can't really put it into words what that feels like until you put someone who's done another discipline of motorsport in a top level hill climb car. And it doesn't happen very often, because you can't just go from 0 to DJ Firestorm in a hill climb. You've got to go, like I did, Formula Ford.
Yeah, there's steps in between.
Yeah, 1000cc GSXR car, and then I went to a Hayabusa, which is a bit bigger, supercharged Hayabusa, then V6, now V8. And all the time you're developing your own engineering knowledge about the experiences, about tires, about setup, about things like that. The champions, the prolific champions, are the ones who get the car into a window, and they know exactly, well, 5 years ago it happened like this, so we did that. And there's a lot of like wives' tales, but I can't begin to describe the emotional situation on the start line. And everyone's got a very different way of dealing with that pressure. And it's really interesting, because I find a lot of circuit racers, they put the helmet on and they do that, and they sit there and they do stretches and they sort of focus and listen to music. What I do is, I think every time I think about the run, I get stressed. Every time I think about what do I normally do with my right hand around turn 3, I think, start overthinking it. I start obsessing it. As I say, all of the work is up front. If you're doing a run up Shelsley in 22 seconds, it's got to be instinct.
You can't actually be thinking about it.
Not really. I mean, you're not breathing. You're not. Your heart rate's at 5 million, and you've got that bang. That's your shot, right? And it's I remember when I first did the Festival of Speed with a professional outfit with McMurtry, which I know we'll get onto later, but the engineer couldn't understand why I got to the holding paddock, got out of the car and started talking to people about the weather and what ice cream did they have and how do they organize their spice rack and all that sort of stuff, because the last thing I wanted to talk about was the run.
That's interesting because a lot of drivers, well, it's a fairly well-known technique, is visualization. So a lot of drivers will sit in the car, eyes closed, and they're physically sort of running through a lap, or in this case a hill climb, in their mind. You know, I'm going to be braking here, I'm going to be down 2 gears, you know, left, right, okay, back to full power, back up through the gears. So essentially they've got a dry run in their mind. You know, obviously that's the polar opposite for you, that technique will just get you stressed.
I can only speak for myself, but yes, that's the biggest difference between me and Max Chilton. When we work together, I just like to get in the car and just go. The least amount of time I can spend strapped in, guessing or working out what's going on, because actually I think your instincts in a lot of cases are your most powerful tool. In circuit racing, when I've done it, your heart rate will be a million on the start line. That will be no different. But after lap 4, you go, okay, this is the brake, so this is what the tire's doing, this is the balance of the car.
And you know you're sort of dialed into it. I kind of find, you know, the formation lap, my heart rate will be through the roof, and I'll be stressed and, you know, a little bit anxious. And then you get past the first couple of laps, and you're, oh yeah, okay, I can settle down now. I'm into a routine, which is kind of what I was mentioning. You know, you don't get that benefit with a hill climb.
No, and I absolutely advise people to do all their prep, make their decision, and stick with it. You know, you see people dicking about like, oh, I want to. There's a bit of drizzle. I've got to change my tires. I've got to do this. Yeah, but that has other implications. Okay, sure. If the heavens open and it's like, you know, but sometimes you've got to just go with it, and it's a long season. There are a lot of rounds, and there's drop scores if you do make a mistake or have a car issue or whatever. But you absolutely can't sit on the line at Chelsea going, what if I understeer off at first corner, or if I've got oversteer? Because you just have to figure it out. Because if you go in tentatively, you've lost. You know, even in a 1400 horsepower per ton top level single seat hill climb car, if you lose momentum, you're knackered. You've got to just absolutely commit to it, and you've got to pick your strategy. You've got to trust the people around you. I've got some really, really talented guys who help me week in, week out. Cam Sport, who you might have seen on my Instagram, that's Simon, and then obviously Andy and Dell from DJ, who design and build the Firestorm. We have a really kind of even mum and dad, of course. You know, we have a really good committee level. What's the tire strat? What are we doing? You know, have you looked at the data? Why is this doing that? You know, do you want me to do this? Do you want me to do that? And then it's like, right, it's your turn, Alex, and you've just got to go. And I try and be that's what we're doing. That's the setup. That's the decision. Because I think consistency throughout that process is what keeps you calm. And then ultimately, if you do have a problem, you're in a better place to be able to deal with it, I think.
One of the obvious questions here is differences, I guess, with circuit racing. Usually getting some practice in is not too difficult. You know, every race event's going to have a number of practice sessions, then quali, and then probably races. Likewise, you can hire the track or go to a club day and just go out and do laps and get seat time. I'm guessing that's essentially impossible for all of these rounds of the British Hill Climb Championship. I'm guessing these roads are only really available as a hill climb during that one weekend of the year. So the question there comes, how do you improve? How do you get better at this sport?
In the majority of cases, it's time served. There's a bit of an unwritten agreement that private testing at dedicated hill climb venues is not the done thing. So even if you had the resources to hire Shelsley, typically it would be frowned upon. And we've always, the community that is the sort of top 20, top 30 people within the championship have always kind of upheld that. It's a trust thing, really. There are a few, so there's Kames in Scotland, which is a sprint circuit, right? It's kind of halfway between a go-kart track and a normal circuit. And there's one near me called Kerbera, and they're sprints, so they're flat. They're much wider than a typical hill climb. The mu of the track, the coefficient of grip is very different. And obviously it's not uphill, so all the starts are different and so on. But you can develop the car there to a point, but you're you're not able to go and do 3 days at Chelsea the week of the thing. So it's not banned per se, but there is a very healthy unwritten agreement that we don't do that, because it's an unfair advantage in a fashion, isn't it?
Yeah. So two points you've just sort of brought up there. One, pretty clear from what you're saying here that becoming proficient fast and winning a British Hill Climb Championship is really going to favour those who have simply been doing it for a number of years, because you're just going to get to visit these hill climb venues over and over again, building up your knowledge of the track. And I'm guessing you've got a little notebook, electronic or otherwise, where you're keeping notes of setup, etc., what worked last year. Obviously gives you kind of a bit of a baseline. The other point though is it's not just about knowing the track and understanding where your braking point's going to be, what gear you could be in for a certain corner. It's also about actually developing that chassis. Is the car suffering from too much understeer? What's the natural balance? And that sprint course that you're talking about, that's good for getting that part of the car dialed in, even if you're not really learning the hill climb tracks.
For sure. So a shakedown, a baseline setting, I think fundamentally a car is good. If it's good, it's good. You see in Formula One, if they nail the concept of the car, they generally win or are on the podium every weekend, right? Maybe not so much now, things are a lot closer, but we would go and we would get a base tune on the springs, dampers, aero and stuff at Kerbera, which a lot of most people do, because obviously you don't want to go into the first corner of an actual hill climb with no knowledge of what you've got. But that's also the place where we go and try rogue stuff. So we often taught me, Andy and Simon, about a complete step change in concept of the car, hot swapping a damper with another damper that's twice as stiff and going, we've never tried it, so how do we know if it's shit or not? But you generally, then when you go do your hill climb, you go, right, well, we're going to be within 25 foot-pound bandwidth of this spring rate. We're going to do a couple of clicks to the left. We might drop the front wing. We might do that. All the engineering, all the big stuff, all the sort of high-level conceptual stuff, you would definitely do at a test track or a runway or something like that, particularly with lots of runoff. So if there is an issue. But learning how to set up a car and learning what to do when it's not good, I think, is a massively important part of hill climbing. It was an important part of any motorsport, but typically you get more driver engineers, people doing the same job, where I would go to my team and I'd say, I recommend, we've got understeer, perhaps let's lift the rear spring rate, and they'd go, here's all the reasons why that might be a crap idea, but actually the only way to test that is to actually test it, but we're going to do it like this and we're going to do it like that. So that's a really important part of it. And I think the reason then time served helps is you try and stick with the same car, you try not to make massive concept changes mid-season, and you try and not reinvent the rule book every year with the engineering, and then you can have this cumulative knowledge. And I think where you look at some of the really successful people, Scott Moran, whose car I actually drove to the championship, and then more recently Wallace Mingus, where they've got the car into a window, they've got the team around them, they don't change too much, and what they do change they really fully understand before they get there, and then they go win 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 win. So Wallace did 4 championships on the bounce, 3 of which I finished second in, which is somewhat demoralizing, but in the nicest possible way. I feel very much historically that he did a better job from a consistency, from a team, from a prep. I would get out of the car and go to the pub, and he would go and do data and stuff like that. And that's the mark of the man, and that's the mark of why he's so successful.
So it comes down to that dedication that you were talking about earlier.
For sure. The cars are very different. The Gould and the Firestorm are very different. But I don't sit there and think, well, if I did this and I had that and he had this, and because you've got to look at, again, like I said at uni, you've got to look at the things you're not doing. And one of the things I'm doing this season, and I'm having a much more consistent season than I've had in years, racing a chap called Matt Ryder in another Gould who's doing fabulously well. I'm the metronomic with how I do everything on the weekend, not just the racing, but how I prep, what I do, when I go to bed, the kind of things I'm eating when I arrive, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to emulate some of that secret sauce that Scott and Wallace and lots before them had. When I won my championship, I was driving under the tutelage of Scott and his father Roger, both of whom are champions. So Scott is the GOAT of British hill climbing. He's 6 times a champion. He's got something ludicrous, like 150 wins in his Gould, and his dad was a champion in 1997. So when I joined their team, it was, we do this, you eat bananas, you go to bed at this time. This is the famous chair that you sit in and contemplate how crap you were after that run.
And don't go to the pub.
Yeah, exactly. There was a lot of that. Roger at one point went up to my mum and said, Alex has had too many bananas. Right, that's a 10th. But they took me from what I was doing before, and they went, this is how you do it. And I would go, oh, can we change this on the car? I go, no, because it's a science project and you'll probably get lost down some road doing that. So they were a massively positive influence. And like I say, it's not just time served, it's using that time wisely to build a box of memories, of, as you say, having a notebook, looking at the data and understanding, introducing changes to the car in a pragmatic, considered way rather than just throwing paint at the wall.
I can only imagine these cars are so complicated that you've got so many individual levers that you've got available to pull to make a tuning or setup change, that if you don't do that in a considered way, in a scientific method, that you could get yourself so far out of the ballpark that you'll never see your way back. So yeah, it comes back to what you're saying before. These cars that they've been racing them season after season, they're dialed in. There's no sort of Hail Mary changes that they're making. It's tiny incremental improvements or changes to sort of drive towards an improved time. I just wanted to take a moment out of our chat with Alex and talk about a package of courses that are going to be perfect for anyone who's enjoying what they're listening to and wants to take their skills on track or on a hill climb to the next level. And that is our Track Day Starter Package. Normally valued at $397 US. You can use the coupon code ALEX100, that's ALEX100. That'll get you $100 off your purchase price. This package starts with our Race Driving Fundamentals course, which will teach you the fundamental knowledge you need to understand in order to get the best out of any car on the racetrack. Obviously, the skill set of driving a road car on the street under legal conditions is very, very different to what we need to do on the racetrack, and this will bridge the gap in most people's knowledge. You'll learn about concepts such as trail braking. You'll also learn about line choice and how to choose the correct line through a particular part of the track. You'll also learn about defensive lines versus a qualifying lap line, and you'll learn about the racecraft that you'll need to understand in order to maximize your chances when you're racing door to door. Even subtle aspects such as where you should be looking on the racetrack. Moving on from this, we're also including our motorsport wheel alignment course, which teaches you how to perform your own wheel alignments at the home workshop or even at the side of the racetrack using relatively cost-effective equipment. This is really important because if you are currently relying on a wheel alignment professional to perform your alignment, then you've got no ability to change the alignment at the track to suit the changing weather conditions, maybe your tire wear, or even to affect the balance of your car. You'll learn how you can go about this, and you'll find out that it's actually relatively quick and easy. Next, we include our practical corner weighting course, and if you've ever walked around the pits at any professional race meeting, you've almost certainly seen cars set up on a flat patch with corner weight scales under each corner of the car. This is an important technique if you want to optimize the balance and handling of your car, and we'll show you exactly how you can do so. Lastly, we're also including our data analysis fundamentals course, and in my opinion, this is one of the fastest ways to improve your lap times, particularly if you know how to analyze your data and you can overlay it with a reference lap with someone such as a driving coach, a professional race driver, or for that matter, even one of your friends who's just faster than you in the car. And you don't need to have thousands of dollars invested in professional data logging equipment in order to use this course. We're also including 24 months of gold membership, which gives you access to our private members-only forum. This is the best place to get reliable and trustworthy answers to your specific racing questions. You'll also get access with that gold membership to our weekly live webinars where we cover a particular topic in the performance automotive scene, dive deep into that for around about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions questions and get answers in real time. But if the time zones don't work for you, you can review these as a gold member in our webinar archive, where we've got over 350 hours of existing content. Total value of this package is $912 US, and using that coupon code ALEX100, you can get it for just $297 US. You are still protected with our 60-day no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase and for any reason at all decide it's not what you expected, let us know. We'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. You are also able to break that $297 US payment down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments at the checkout to make it as cost effective as we can. You'll find that coupon code and a link to this package in the show notes. Now let's get back to our chat with Alex. Coming back to the actual cars, and I think probably since we've been talking and I've got a better understanding of the caliber of these cars, it's probably answered the question anyway, but just for the sake of completeness, I would see if we had a clean sheet of paper approach to what would be the car to purchase or build or whatever for a competitive hill climb car. I would have thought that an existing race car that's available would probably be a good starting point. And I mean, the go-to one that popped into my mind would be the Wolf that Robin Shute has proven to be somewhat effective at hill climbing at Pikes Peak, albeit in a very different format than how it rolled out of the factory at Wolf. But really now it sounds like what we're talking about here is fully fledged Formula One cars turned up to 12.
Sure. So the car I won the championship in was a Rolt Formula 3 chassis with a IndyCar engine and an Arrows, and I think it's 1991 Arrows Formula 1 transaxle gearbox. And then essentially the running gear in inverted commas, the uprights, wishbones, wheels, and so on, as sort of either XF1 or Formula 3000. So that was back then when the technology was really hard to penetrate. That was how people got carbon chassis, and that's how people got engines and gearboxes. Now with the advent of far cheaper machining of patterns and things for composites and CAD software being available, like Fusion 360 for example, available as freeware, there's been an explosion more recently of specials, quote unquote. So if you look at the Wolf and various other things like the Norma and so on that are really popular in Europe, they're what we call sports Libre cars. So they're sort of a two-seater in all but reality. And they're built to a spec, so a minimum weight spec that they have to run in Europe. I think Robin might have. I know Robin fairly well, but I know it's got a Toyota turbo engine in the back. The wings from Robin's car are actually built by the people who built the Firestorm, interestingly enough, which is how we sort of got to speak. But now you would take the smallest, most powerful engine, the smallest, lightest possible chassis that fits a human in, and a gearbox that's reliable and not too heavy, and that would be your starting point. So it's very rare now that people make top level hill climb cars that are based on something that went before it. I think there is one Formula 3 chassis in the top 10 British Championship at the moment, and that has an IndyCar engine strapped in the back of it. So I think a lot of people think initially that would be the cheaper way to go, but nowadays it's not quite true.
Sure. The flip side of this, though, is, could you take something that's winning in the British Hill Climb Championship, and how would that go then at Pikes Peak? Now, I'm going to assume probably the first and foremost issue there is getting enough fuel into the damn thing to make it to the top. Obviously, we're talking about a 8-minute run up a hill versus, 20 to 60 seconds. But I mean, if we forget about the fact that you're going to run out of fuel a quarter of the way up, how would that actually work out in reality? Is it going to be competitive, or are the design criteria just too different?
No, it would be mega competitive. I did a couple of events in Europe, and most recently we went to Portugal, a place called Braga. But they were 3-kilometer tracks, full road width, much more like Pikes Peak in terms of the way the roads are. They're proper roads with like drainage, camber in them and stuff. And the only thing I found was that at high speed I had too much downforce. The car was running along the ground, and it was quite tricky to get that right. If you went back, you would run the car a lot stiffer and you would do certain things. But from an attribute point of view, we were the lightest cars there. We had the most power. By rights, on paper, empirically, we should have absolutely monstered it. What we were finding is at 145 mile an hour, we're doing 4G, and the car's just never been anywhere like that. and the tire pressures were too low. The springs weren't stiff enough. We were cold binding. We were hitting on the bump stops, and and it's something you mentioned that to me before we started recording is like, what would they be like on circuits? Initially, they would be rubbish, but it would be with a bit of someone cleverer than me helping. You would be able to make something like a GL59 or a Firestorm absolutely ballistic around a circuit. What we would have to do, and it wouldn't be too difficult in terms of where you would tool it, but you would just extend the length of the chassis, get fuel in. The other problem, so the Formula 3 and the F1 derived cars, the sort of early noughties, like the ones I won championship in, they had their oil tanks in the bell housing of the gearbox so that the back of the chassis was devoted to fuel. And what happens now on the Firestorm, for example, and most other cars, is the fuel tank and the oil tank are next to each other behind the seat. So you've got room for about 10 litres. That's it. And on methanol, that's just nothing. That's absolutely nothing. That's using twice as much methanol to get stoic chemistry as you would petrol or thereabouts. So we would have to do something similar, put the oil tank in the belt housing. We'd have to put more fuel in, and then obviously what invariably happens is the wheelbase starts to creep up, the weight starts to creep up, and so on. So I dare say we would end up at something a little bit like what Robin's got now, which is a formidable bit of kit. But I know Robin's been sort of eyeing my Cosworth XD with lust. We've talked about what that would be like. Obviously, the XD was originally turbocharged Indy. We run it naturally aspirated because, to be honest, we don't need the admin and the paperwork associated with turbos.
That was actually going to be one of my questions. With an open rule book, turbocharging versus naturally aspirated. I mean, on the plus side, with turbocharging, all other things being equal, it's going to be easier to make a lot of power. But then you've got turbo response and lag to deal with. But more importantly, as I'd see it, is there's a huge amount of complexity, heat, weight, cooling requirements that go along with turbocharging that might make the benefits of additional power actually not that attractive.
Well, so me and another guy called Josh Goodyear and various other people who tried it, but Josh and I sort of took it to its absolute limit. We ran before in sort of 2013, 2014, before I got into the Gould, which is a big naturally aspirated car. We ran supercharged Hayabusa engines in the back of custom hill climb cars. So I had a thing called a DJ Firehawk, which was a gorgeous thing, absolutely lovely, and it had this drag bike Hayabusa engine, and it had a Rotrex supercharger on it, which is well worth a Google if you've not heard of them, because they're great for all sorts. So they look like a turbo, and it's driven off a belt off the crankshaft, or a pulley off the crankshaft. And we were making 395 brake horsepower at the back wheels from a 1296 Hayabusa. We were running methanol fuels, so we didn't have to run an intercooler. So we had priming injectors in the top of the manifold, and then injectors close to the actual intake valve, which is quite common with methanol. So we would have inlet temperatures in 20 degrees when the actual turbine compressor exit temperatures were sort of 85, 90 degrees because of the way it was fueled. And the car was 355 kilos, and it made 400 brake at the back wheel, so probably close to 500 at the crank, something like that. And it was a ballistic missile, but fragile. And fragile because a boost pipe would blow up, because it was never designed like that. Everything was done by the engine builder and by DJ, and it was a prototype. It was always a prototype. And when it worked, it was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. But things like problems you can't even imagine, like oil surge, because we would change the motorbike sump, which is very deep, to being flat, and then we've got to get an oil tank in there now, and we were putting in things that needed to be there, and we were creeping up and up and up on weight towards a small naturally aspirated V8 in terms of cost. Anyway,
yeah, I guess there's also it's hard. We go through this with our SR86 endurance car. We are home building a car for all intents and purposes and try to compete with factory-based TCRs. A factory-built race car is very hard to compete with. And in the same vein, there you're modifying a production motorcycle engine into a form that it's never been before, whereas a production or a bespoke motorsport-based V8, it's designed fit for purpose. Everything about it is being designed for the stresses that are going to be involved, and hard to believe, but they're just going to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so about the only motorbike engine drive thing at the moment is Trevor Willis, who's got the PowerTech RPE Hayabusa V8, which is two Hayabusas on a custom crankcase, and he runs it on methanol, and he doesn't run any radiators, for example. So it's super light. The car is super light, loads of torque, loads of power, and it doesn't have any, or has very little ancillary mass, very little drag as a result of that. So what you find with people who've tried supercharged and turbocharged, by the time they're working effectively, they are more complicated, more expensive, and ultimately you've still got lag, you've still got heat issues, you've still got transmission limitations, certainly with bike engines and stuff. So yeah, on paper people go turbocharge it, and you just don't need the stress. Literally and metaphorically, you can take a IndyCar Cosworth like mine and run it without the turbos and still get close to 700 bhp, and it weighs 100 kilos, 120 kilos in my case, a bit less for the Judd, maybe 110. So the car is still 430, 440 kilos, even with a fucking great big IndyCar engine V8 in the back. So it's quite hard to get to that kind of horsepower per tonnage and that level of relative touchwood reliability and simplicity on a short course. So history doesn't offer a great deal of examples of successful turbo or supercharged cars in British hill climbing, because at the point where you get it working, you've put so much time, effort, money into it, and someone goes, look, have this retired IndyCar engine that no one's using that's actually remarkably cheap, relatively speaking, of course, for the purpose.
I think the other thing with a lot of these sort of retired race engines, the purchase price of the engine itself is often surprisingly cheap for what you're getting. And part of that sort of comes with that cheaper price is the problem, of course, when it comes to a time for a freshen up. That's going to be, particularly if you want to send it back to base, it's going to be eye-wateringly expensive. But of course the difference here was we sort of went down this hypothetical sort of discussion, not that we ever had the finances for it. One of my favourite engines of all times, the Judd V10, Ryan Turk's Formula Supra, is a crowd favourite because of the noise it makes. But when you look, I'm not on their website, so take this with a grain of salt. I think those engines have a time between rebuilds of something like 4 or maybe 5,000 racing kilometres, which granted is a fairly decent distance, but when you're doing endurance racing, you're going to chew through that time pretty quickly. And again, I hate to think what sending an engine back to Judd for a freshen up is going to cost. That's probably a lifetime or maybe 2 lifetimes of hill climbing, just because you are literally not doing the kilometres, correct?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, our engines make financial sense in the application they're in, but I'm always very glad to turn them off at the end of the season and send them back and get the engine builder to go, yep, put them back in the car.
All still looks good. Yeah.
We might do 180 miles competitively a year, so we tend to do 2 or 3 seasons on the XD before we get it rebuilt. But Cosworth, actually, surprisingly, the heritage department have always been reasonably good because they love the engine. I think it's really exciting, and they make a huge amount of effort to accommodate. We also use other engine builders, a chap called Trevor Morris. He does the P40 engines, and he's more recently started doing some of the service work on the Cosworth as well. So there's a good scene of people who can run those engines. Obviously now it's easier to make pistons and conrods and even machine blocks. I mean, the technology now to make bearings and the things that you need to replace, right? Conrods, pistons, bearings, valves and stuff. The technology's there to make them.
Yeah, so I guess time has moved on a little bit from when these engines were relatively new.
A huge amount.
All right, I just want to talk a little bit more in detail about the aerodynamics. You've already kind of given us a bit of an understanding of where these cars are, sort of unrestricted Formula One, essentially. One of the issues I would potentially see, and maybe I'm just off track here, is obviously aerodynamics. A lot of it comes down to the underbody and the ride height sensitivity in terms of within reason, the lower you can run the car to the ground, the more effective the wing and the underbody is going to be, and the more downforce you get. However, that's all well and good on a nice smooth racetrack which most of the racetracks are relatively smooth. You can get away with that. Hill climbs, I haven't been to any of those tracks, obviously, but I'm going to guess if they're anything like the hill climbs that we have locally, they're not a smooth billiard table like a racetrack. So what sort of compromises are you putting in here in terms of getting the suspension to work? I would assume that you've got a broader range of travel on a hill climb suspension setup than a circuit race suspension setup. And then how does that sort of drive the aerodynamic performance?
So we run a thing on, in fact, all of the top cars run a thing called a heave spring or a heave damper. I actually recently put a video filmed the rear suspension on the Firestorm and put it on Instagram because
I saw that. It's quite impressive watching it all work.
It's quite cool, isn't it? And I just watched it and went, I've got to share that. That's so cool. When do you ever see that? But essentially, you've got two corner springs which you have very soft to give you the traction and roll compliance that you need. We don't run a rear anti-roll bar on the Firestorm or even on the P40, but you have quite a lot of droop because a lot of the corners have a lot of gradient and things, and you want the inside wheel, all the tractive wheels to be on the ground at all times. But that heave spring effectively stops the car from bottoming out. On the P40, I run packers in the dampers and things to get the same effect. And then on the front of the car, they're usually monoshock. The Firestorm was dual shock until recently, but I've gone monoshock now. It's a single front spring. So it's effectively a monoshock. Monoshock is just a heave spring. So it just limits the ride height. The roll compliance on a monoshock is done by a set of belvels on a bell crank that slides side to side. If you've got two push rods going into it, they can move side to side essentially. But the rotational moment on the bell crank is pure heave. There's no intrinsic ability for the wheels to roll independently on the front axle other than the compliance in that bell crank. So on the P40, the car I designed, the front suspension is rock solid, and I mean rock solid. You're getting like 3 or 4, maybe 5 mil of deflection in it. And then the rear suspension, your minimum ride height is 40 mil on a hill climb car in the UK, static ride height. When you're running, in theory, there is no limit, but we tend to run rake to stop the car from bellying out. So we run a huge amount of rising rate. It would be the phrase I would use between the heave spring and the natural rising rate of the bell crank ratios on the rear and front suspension, and the packers. So a lot of accidents in the past could possibly have been attributed to floor stall, but we make a lot of effort now to avoid bottoming out. There's only a few places where you can feel my car ground out, and they're very subtle. They're tend to be things that we then go back to organizers and say, well, maybe that compression needs to be manicured or resurfaced or whatever. So we make a lot of effort to avoid slamming the deck. And one of the things that the Firestorm is superb at is high speed compliance, high speed manners. And I think a lot of people, when they watch the Firestorm, want all credit to DJ for doing it, but it rides bumps and curbs and things in such a good way because it's very soft initially, and you can see that on that video. It gives you the traction off the start line and the roll compliance and so on, but it gets to a point and it just doesn't move anymore.
Okay. There's, again, a bunch of points that you've brought up there that I think warrant us diving into a little bit more detail. And so for a start, just to kind of set the scene, with a car that produces a massive level of downforce, the problem that we have is that the downforce is correlated to speed. And we get into a situation where the faster we go, obviously that downforce is pushing the car down, so the ride height drops. So we have to have some way of controlling the ride height at speed, and there's a variety of ways of doing this. You mentioned about packers there. So one of the obvious ways would be we just run an incredibly stiff spring rate, which will work at speed, but then we're giving away mechanical grip at low speed where we don't have that downforce. So that's not really desirable. We want to run a softer spring rate so we've got that compliance and the low speed grip. So we can run bump stops or packers, so as the car comes down it sort of actually sits on these packers. We can run this rising rate geometry, so essentially the spring rate or the wheel rate becomes stiffer as the ride height drops. The part that I wanted you to maybe explain a little bit more detail, and this is probably tricky without some diagrams, but this concept of the heave spring, which is certainly not new on anything that produces a huge amount of downforce. Could you give us a high-level view of how the heave springs front and rear work?
So a heave spring, essentially, if you've got two corner springs attached to a bell crank, you want those to be able to bump and rebound independently, unless you have a roll bar. So let's say you have no roll bar, you want those to be able to bump independently. And you have on the bell crank, you've got a spring going forward in car line towards the front of the car, and then you've got a tie rod on the back of the bell crank going to another bell crank, which can swivel without any resistance. So the springs can still move together. But when the spring move independently, but when the springs heave, or the car heaves pure bump straight down, imagine pulling the car down from underneath. When those bell cranks move together, those rods pull against a third spring, right? So the third spring does nothing when the car's rolling, because you just don't want that for obvious reasons. But when you're going up and those springs start to move together, the system assumes, although it is inanimate, but it assumes then that you're in a pure heave scenario, and then you go, right, that's when I want my ride height to limit. So I might get 20 mil delta of wheel movement, one in bump, one in rebound, and again lots of droop on steep rising corners with traction. And then when they start to move together, the system is in heave or in traction or whatever, and then it will then squat to a precise height. And the third spring, the bumps, it's got bump stops and various elements on it. It will progressively limit the ride height, but only when those springs are moving in the same direction.
Yeah, so you've essentially decoupled the independent wheel movement and the roll motion from pure heave, allowing you to essentially get the best of both worlds. You can still run a soft compliant spring rate on each corner without driving the thing underneath the ground at high speed.
Yeah, and the old adage in hill climbing, certainly in the UK, is the front's bollock stiff. If the inside front wheel comes off the ground, it doesn't matter because all the mass is at the back, and you've also got no tractive effort on the front axle typically, so two-wheel drive. But if you were going to do a four-wheel drive car, we would probably avoid a monocoque, and you would have a similar heave and a corner spring arrangement there. So that if you look at Formula One cars, they will have rising rate suspension, both in terms of the bell crank ratio and a third element that will only act when both springs bump in the same direction.
Okay. Again, we've kind of glossed over what is a pretty complex system in a couple of minutes. So, probably I hope if people want to find out a little bit more, we've primed them with enough information to drive Google in the right direction. All right, I want to move forward. I'm going to, unfortunately, time-wise, have to gloss over a few things here. Sufficient to say that you've mentioned this term P4T a few times, which is your own home-built car. The P4T, just to fill in the blanks here and not taking words out of your mouth, but as I understand it, was about a 7-year build time, and this uses a steel tube frame style of chassis. Right, we'll park that for the moment. That was just sort of setting the scene. What I want to talk about is, again, just sort of stalking your Instagram for a while while I was prepping for this interview. I see that you're basically now in the midst of developing the new version of the P4T. What is interesting to me is you're doing a lot of composite work, and this one is designed around a carbon fiber monocoque instead of the steel tube frame. Great. Nothing new here. This is the norm in the likes of IndyCar, F1, basically all of the top level wings and slicks style of race cars. I would have assumed, however, that designing and developing and building a carbon fiber monocoque was outside of the realms of anything but a professional race car manufacturer, given the need for, at least as I understand it, these really need to be cured in an autoclave. Give us the rundown. How did this start, and why the monocoque for a start?
So the original space frame car was, the whole concept of the car was an itch I needed to scratch to do my own, but to create a shape that I thought it's subjective, but something very sort of spectacular to look at, very low, very curvaceous, and all those sorts of things. And it really never, it was a technical project. It was never about winning a championship or anything like that. And it was actually designed specifically to get short people comfortable in, particularly women in motorsport, because my mum and my wife both race. And that's where it's become a bit notable, because we ended up as a family winning the Sims medal with the Royal Automobile Club for doing that project with a specific bent on ergonomics and packaging and so on. With the space frame, it was what we had around us, the technology, the skills, the people we knew. But throughout my professional career, and certainly throughout my motorsport career, I have learned how to laminate pre-preg carbon fiber. I've learned how to do that stuff. And it got to the point where, from a sort of ergonomic point of view, the limitations were tubes and positioning and nodes and so on. and that the logical progression to make that car better and even more accessible and comfortable, ergonomically proficient for shorter drivers. I'm only 5'6", so I kind of put myself in that bracket, was to go into composites. And now, as we sort of alluded to earlier on, there's a really good community of people within UK motorsport who do make their own composites. So DJ, who make the Faststorm, they make all their own composites. Gould, obviously, is the same, and they've gone from wet layup to out of autoclave pre-preg carbon fiber I cured in an oven, which is a perfectly good way of doing it, to then autoclaves. And all of those people have helped me develop my experience and knowledge and skills and so on. So a project like this is a collaborative effort. It always is a collaborative effort. And DJ have been absolutely fantastic. Gould have been fantastic as well, going left a bit, right a bit, don't do this, don't do that. Even to the point where some of these companies say, look, you laminate it, you put it in a bag, and we'll clave it for you.
All right. Perfect.
So you put the mold in the back of the thing. I do have my own oven, and that's good for warm debulks, and I cure my bodywork in an oven. And I think you could do a tub in an oven, and lots of people have. And as long as you get a good bag and good consolidation, and you've thought about your laminates and your hard points and release adhesive films and stuff, I think it is doable.
Give us a rundown on the pre-preg carbon fiber. Actually, there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm definitely not a composites expert, so I'll just preface this discussion with that. But the pre-preg, at least as I understand it, one of the advantages with it is it's guaranteed to have the correct component of epoxy, which is hard to get with a wet layup. But the pre-preg needs to be cured in an oven. You've got your own oven, as you mentioned, for doing the body parts. You could do the same, I'm guessing here, which you sort of alluded to, with the monocoque. Where do the advantages come in with using an autoclave versus just curing in an oven?
So generally, as the ply stack, as we call it, as you get thicker on more and more plies, more and more layers. So typically carbon, I'll simplify, pre-preg carbon comes in 200 gram, 400 gram, 600 gram, roughly. And each one of those, if 200 gram carbon is approximately 1/4 of a mil thick when cured, 400 approximately double that, 600 approximately treble that. So when you get to a composite structure, it might have 2 mil, 3 mil, let's say, of monolithic carbon on its outer skin. You either have to do loads and loads of individual debulks to get the consolidation and get all the air out, which is a vacuum bag to consolidate those plies. You're still not guaranteed to get a very good surface finish or a perfect surface finish unless every single thing is absolutely perfect and you've done all your debulks and everything like that. What a clave does is it puts 8 bar of pressure on the other side of the bag and mashes that composite into the mold. And it's a much better way of guaranteeing that effectively, if the ply stack isn't consolidated, the resin starts to flow and your resin fraction becomes incorrect. So if you've got 6 mil of nominal carbon and it's actually 10 mil because it's not got enough pressure on it, you're going to get weak spots, you're going to get voids and bridging and all sorts of stuff like that. So it is always the best way. The way you would do it in an oven is you do much more cure stages. But in an autoclave, you could do 3 or 4 plies in one cure and you just know it's going to come out perfect. Whereas with an oven, you might cure the outer skin, then you've got to abrade it, clean it up, put adhesive film down, put the next few plies on it. So it's just a lot more protracted way of doing it. So there is an option with the contacts I'm very fortunate to have, where you could laminate it, put it in a truck, take it down, and they bag it up and put it through the autoclave for you. And that just guarantees that all your metal hard points, all your laminates and everything are going to be absolutely perfect. Because if you've got a vacuum, you've only got 1 bar essentially of pressure on that surface. If you've got that plus 8 bar, then I don't need to tell you that it will be much more consolidated as a laminate. But out of autoclave pre-pregs are really, really good. The nose cones on P40 are out of autoclave. They're supplied by a company called Easy Composites, the materials, and the results are fantastic. I mean, you can absolutely swing off that nose cone. I've never crashed it yet, but I'm pretty sure it would be more than robust enough. So to sort of simplify your question, the way I think it's possible is I'm very fortunate to have very talented people and good contacts who I've kind of come up with. Simon of Camsport, who you can see on the back wing of the P4, he's a composites tooling designer. And we met, he used to work at DJ, he now does all sorts of things. And he's going to help with tooling, loose tooling and molds and die locking and pattern machining and so on. And then laminating, I've done loads of now, so I'm reasonably comfortable doing that. Other companies are helping with expertise on things like core materials, aluminiums, inserts and things. So, yeah, there's a good community here that I think makes it possible. but it's still very ambitious, right? But
Definitely. I mean, it's no joke, but yeah, probably something that would be a much steeper challenge to face based in the Southern Hemisphere, I think, than in the middle of kind of motorsport alley in the UK.
yeah, possibly.
In terms of using the monocoque versus the space frame style of design, I'm assuming here that the advantages come primarily from weight, and I'm guessing kind of with the ergonomics, you're getting more space internally for the same external footprint. Do we also get benefits from rigidity here as well?
So the principal benefits are you get more internal volume for a given outer package, right? Because it's thinner walls. You've got to have a skin, then a tube, then a seat in a space frame. And in a tub, you just have effectively the skin, the core, and inner place. You also get anti-penetration benefits insofar as a single skin tub will resist things like wishbones and stones coming in far better than a space frame, if that makes sense. So anti-intrusion is a real engineering challenge on space frames, and it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about on the original P40. And the more anti-intrusion bars, the more weight. So that's the next benefit, is the weight. In terms of torsional stiffness, now I've got a real different view on torsional stiffness. Some of the nicest cars I've ever driven in hill climbs have been fairly unstiff, torsionally speaking. In a lot of cases, space frame cars, things like Westfields, they're absolutely lovely and really compliant. And you've got to think about a chassis as one of the springs in the system. So when people talk about torsional rigidity, they go, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be massively stiff. And you go, well, it's got to be slightly stiff. Yeah, stiffness is very rarely the problem. It's actually, in a lot of cases, when I've gone into composites, tubs and stuff, I thought, oh God, it's taken a while to get the handling back to where I like it, because that's an inherent flex in the chassis, which people, it might sound alarming that I'm saying this, but anyone who's spent any time engineering a chassis, you do consider the chassis as being the fifth spring in some cases, right? And it's torsional rigidity and the way the roll bars and stuff work is a whole connected system. So I think the space frame P40, in terms of handling dynamically, is more than stiff enough. It's actually one of the things I'm worried about moving to a carbon tub, because we've got the P40 handling really, really nicely with the space frame. You go and treble maybe the torsional stiffness of the chassis, you will affect its handling, and it won't necessarily, subjectively speaking, be better. It might objectively be better, but it might take a long time for us to get the handling back to where the P40 is now, when it's such a profound change in the stiffness.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sort of, you've mentioned the intrusion or anti-intrusion benefits there. One of the questions I had here is along the lines of safety. Obviously, these things are no joke. You're driving very fast up a hill that's very narrow, and we don't have gravel traps or all of the associated safety devices that we'll see at a permanent racetrack. Did you go through any sort of analysis, FEA, etc., to kind of come up with numbers in terms of safety, or is this sort of,
It's a difficult thing to empiricize, right? Because first point is actually British Hill Climb Championship venues are now really good in the vast majority of cases for barriers, and we've got a lot of really dedicated marshals and rescue crew and stuff like that. So I think the venues are probably more advanced than you'd imagine. There's certainly runoff areas in some places, catch fencing and stuff like that. In terms of analysis on the space frame, everything I did was hand calcs, because I'm a great believer. And if you don't understand the hand calculations, then probably your simulations will be wrong anyway, right? If it's shit in, shit out, essentially. So if what I always did was I would take a tube and I'd say, what's the critical buckling load of this? If I have an accident here, where do I brace it? How do I manage all those loads, and so on and so forth? That is an intrinsic part, and it's relatively easy to do with a space frame, because you're dealing with isotropic members and nodes, right? Isotropic means material properties are the same in every direction. The problem with composites is they're anisotropic. They have different, you've got plies at 90 degrees to each other, strands at 90 degrees to each other, these cross fibers. And at 45 degrees, the materials are quite flexible, relatively speaking. So it's very, very difficult to simulate how strong something will be or how stiff something will be. If you don't have all of the information and really complex simulation tools, you're probably going to mess it up. You probably end up with bullshit numbers. So for me, again, the journey on the composite structure in terms of safety has been literature. So what's gone before, and trying to understand why it's got to that laminate. There's some like pretty well respected laminates that people use. If it's much lighter than a Formula 3 chassis, then maybe you've missed something important. And then the other thing is bending and hand calcs and things like that, right? So your core sizes in certain areas, certainly around the hard points for chassis components like wishbones and springs and so on, you want to be able to put a load that you've resolved from the contact patch using basic calculations and go, is that going to bend? Because if it's going to bend, it's probably going to, appreciably, then it's probably not enough. Safety is one of those things that if you take it to its logical conclusion, you stop driving a racing car up a hill at 150 mile an hour.
It's always walking that sort of razor's edge between something that is safe but also light and fast.
Yeah, for me it's hand calcs. Like the nose cone is a crush can on a Formula 1 car, and it is so on a hill climb car, and I think it's going to decelerate over a given distance, and we need it to decelerate at this rate. And if you did a frontal impact at 30 mile an hour, would it be retained? What would the deceleration be like? What kind of G loading would you get? So I tend to do all my calcs from a dynamic point of view based on it's about 4G lateral, it's about 600 kilos with cover factor, so on and so forth. You've got downforce to consider, you've got bump, shock loads and things. The old 3G bump kind of starting point is a kind of well-known industry standard. And then from a safety thing, what's gone before, test it. You make a test laminate and stamp it, or try and bend it, put it in an Instron. That's all stuff that we've thought about, all that stuff that we're certainly considering doing.
Okay. No, that makes perfect sense. All right, as I said, I was sort of really briefly covering that off because I do want to respect your time. One last topic, well, maybe last topic that I did want to cover off, which I think would be remiss if we didn't dive into, it's your involvement with the McMurtry automotive team. I mean, this thing has kind of set the world on fire in terms of what's capable with a purpose-built EV race car, setting the outright record up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. Give us sort of the backstory on how you got involved with the team.
So we go back to my university days in Formula Student. There was a TBR, Team Bath Racing team, I forget what year, I think TBR 9, and they were referred to as TBR Dream. And there was this guy called Tom Yates, and he is the managing director of McMurtry. And he was a final year of Bath Uni when I was a freshman. And he got to hear that I'd got a hill climb car. And I obviously wanted to impress all the seniors. Said, why don't you come and drive it? And it was an OMS with a Honda Blackbird engine in the back. And he had a go in it. He went, oh, wow, this is fucking amazing. This is great. And I drove their former student car at the Silverstone event in 2009. And the chief engineer for them is also that year, a chap called Kevin, and various other members of the team at the top level. And they went off and did all the things, and they went to various OEMs and stuff when we all graduated uni, and we kind of parted ways. And then I'd heard a rumor that this chap, Sir David McMurtry, who is known for setting up Renishaw, which makes CMM probes and things like that. So that's his baby, or he was one of the founding members. I forget exactly the detail, but he was also one of the chief engineers on Concorde, this guy, Sir David. So McMurtry gets its namesake from Sir David McMurtry. And he went to Bath Uni and he went, I want the 6 cleverest people you can possibly get your hands on, but I don't want them to have any prior idea of how to do this. So he had a really clear vision for a small car that was just going to set the world on fire. And you have to say he's manifested it. It's become this thing. But Tom Yates and the team and various other guys, George Schultz and people like that who have been involved, are all people from uni that I knew. And when the phone call came for Sir David to my academic supervisor from uni to say, let's have the brightest buttons that you've had, of course, they didn't phone me, which I've always...
For reasons we've previously discussed.
Yeah, probably. But then, 5-6 years later, I kept hearing rumors that this project had taken off and that Mercury Automotive had been set up, and curiosity killed the cat. And I got a phone call one day saying, it's ready. Please come and have a go. We want you to drive it. And I went, well, great, absolutely. So I turned up to the first test and I ended up showing the car with Derek Bell, which is a clang name drop. But that is what happened. And I sort of went, pinch me, this is ridiculous. We drove the car and we took it to the Goodwood Festival of Speed the first year, and it all worked really well. We finished every run, and it was like a really, really lovely foundation for the whole project. Super ambitious, amazing thing. People kind of looked at it and went, "What is this? It looks like a Batmobile," and so on. And it didn't that year have the fan system running because it was so fledgling. But the following year, after a very condensed development program, the fan system was then active at the 2021 Festival of Speed, I forget. And Max Chilton had signed to be their full-time development driver, which I was really happy with because I thought, I've taken it as far as I can take it. And I've got a full-time job and I've got all sorts of things. I'm married and I'm trying to do hill climbing and crack on, lads. Brilliant. And I thought it would end there really. And I was very sort of at peace with that. And they said, well, we'll keep your number in the phone book. And then Max was at a wedding the Saturday before the shootout, and they said, "Oh, look, can you qualify the car for Max at the Festival of Speed?" And I went, "Oh, let me check." Yes, I can.
It's a hard sell.
Yeah, I turned up to Llandau in Wales, test the car with the full fan system working, and it just was unbelievable, as you can imagine. And I went to Goodwood suddenly feeling quite apprehensive, thinking, now I've got a time to shine, as it were. And of course, what wonderful people around in the community and all my friends from hill climbing and stuff, they tuned in because it was it's been ages since a hill climb driver had done the Festival of Speed, and particularly in something so impressive, something so out there. So I went and I watched Max do a 42-second run through Morecambe on the Friday and went, oh God, I've got to drive that tomorrow. Wow. Because I'd never seen anything like it in my whole life. It sounds like a jet because of the fan system in the back. And I thought, oh wow. But Max had signed up for this wedding, and being the kind of honourable chap he did, he had to do it. And I thought, okay, well, here goes nothing. And I did qualify on the Saturday. Not many people remember that because of what happened the following day, but we qualified 1/10 away from Romain Dumas' unofficial record. So I did a 40 dead, and Romain had done a 39. And that was super high pressure for me because it was 2 runs. The runs I'd done 12 months ago were without the fan system.
Pretty hard to compare.
Yeah, get to Goodwood, turn up, put a suit on, go, oh my God, bang, do the run. And then, of course, you get to the top and they shove a microphone up in your face and you go, ah.
So coming back to kind of where we started this whole conversation with the lack of prep time, you leave that start line and it's all on, and there's no kind of, well, you did have a second chance. I guess you get two runs up the hill. But where I'm going with this is with something so out the gate, particularly that fan setup. I mean, most people probably have seen some video of it sort of vacuuming the track. I mean, you can't help but understand how effective that's going to be. But where I'm going with this is obviously the fan system provides a level of grip and downforce at low speed that traditionally aerodynamics don't work well at. How do you as a driver kind of guess where the limit is going to be on a car like that's just so different?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I mean, the great thing about the car is you can turn the fan through 6 or 7 different settings and the powertrain as well. So you can creep up to a point. So you can go, okay, I've found a limit of understeer or whatever at say 2 and go up with it. In terms of on that particular day at Goodwood, it was, I guess, just all of the hill climbing experience I got. And you brake a bit early, you turn in, you feel the front end bite, great, smash the throttle. And the thing is, because it's more downforce than you expect, it's not as difficult as you might imagine. So you don't have to bleed off the brake pedal as the speed comes down to avoid locking. You don't have to be gentle with the throttle at low speed and so on. So there's an accessibility there that's inherent in the project that's a really core part of it, because you're trying to sell product to people who are not Formula One drivers, people who have road cars and so on and so forth. So if it were inaccessible, that would be contrary to the brief, as it were. So what Max and I have found, and we were lucky that we would go testing and we would go, okay, I'm braking too early, but that's not such an issue. In terms of finding the limit, you do that in a natural way. But I did what I did at the Festival of Speed, and Max did what he did, and we were looking at each other's videos and each other's data and going, there's a bit more. When Max watched my video, I was doing something very different up the straight, and he was a lot quicker than me through turn 1, turn 2 when we sort of compared ideas and so on. But yeah, I think you find the limit in the same way that you do with a car with no downforce, right? You can almost forget downforce because the car just gets grippier the more you turn the dial, which is fabulous. It's absolutely fantastic, and you can't quite explain to someone who hasn't driven it how intuitive that becomes very quickly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I guess, with the car already having that outright record and kind of blowing the doors off the competition, where's the glass ceiling on how much more performance you can extract from something like that car?
I think it's one of those things where we've been looking at Formula One and going, how does it get better? How does it get? Every generation has gone, in the 60s, these cars will never get faster, and then 60 years later, wow.
They keep going faster.
I think at the moment there's a physical threshold that's comfortable, and then there's a bit that's uncomfortable. Launching in a McMurtry is amazing. Beyond that does it then detract from everything else? Right? At what point you've got to make a car? It's got to have subjective attributes as well, right? But in the engineering sense, it's usually, I mean, things like drive shafts and stuff and tires, and you get to a point where you go, okay, 3G lat from 30 mile an hour that's fine, that's great, that's enough. And you could maybe put I mean, the other thing that people don't realize about the Festival of Speed record is that we didn't do a crazy Goodwood spec thing. We did that's the car as it is, and the car's remained unchanged. The silver car, the one I drove this year, has remained unchanged since that festival, essentially.
And Max was driving a new blue car this year at the Festival of Speed. Can you give us any insight on what upgrades, changes, or otherwise have been made to that?
Yeah, so it's a validation prototype, right? So it's a wash up of all of the things that were really good on the first car, and then certain things that they've changed. So it's got a wider tire, it's got a slightly different powertrain. It will end up, I think, having a slightly bigger battery. It's walking through the development process, so it's a very familiar thing to drive, but it's got more tire, it's got various things. So the attributes are all being refined. It's not a wholesale difference. The most obvious thing is the tire, because you can see much more pronounced arches front and rear on the car. But anyone who's driven the first one would feel very home in the second one. It's just a step on the evolutionary walk.
Yeah, I guess the silver car had kind of proven that the concept was pretty well where it needed to be, so no need to make any wholesale changes, just iterative improvements, like we were talking about with the hillclimb cars previously.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of what the logical limit is, watch this space,
I mean, it's super exciting to just see where things have gone, even over the last 5 years. So I can only imagine where things will go to in the next 5 years, and I'm here for the journey. All right, look, Alex, I think we will move towards wrapping this thing up. We're getting a little bit long here, and we've got the same 3 questions, of course, that we ask all of our guests. And the first of those is, what's next in the future for you? Are we Aston Martin for life? More British Hillclimb championships, hopefully?
In the immediate future, yes. Get another championship if possible. Design and develop and bring out the P40 successor, the P80 as I'm calling it. No wholesale changes. No, I'm very satisfied and very happy with how things are going. I've got the right balance at the moment, So yeah, I think I'm going to carry on doing what I'm doing. I really enjoy putting content out about the build of the car, and it seems to be fairly well received. And so yeah, I don't see a reason really to change that. I'm not about to try and become a professional racing driver, if that's the question, because it's not really, I don't want to get lost in something that I'm, maybe not suited to. So more engineering, more design stuff, more playing with cool cars.
It could be worse. I mean, I think the point that you made there about balance is quite critical as well. Particularly, as we get older, and a lot of our listeners will be younger, the balance there is probably different to later life once you're sort of married, particularly if you end up having a family. There are simply different priorities, and that's obviously a natural trajectory as well.
Yeah, it might not sound appealing to some people, but sort of stability becomes more appealing as you get older. And even now, I kind of look for it as much as I can, because I think you can have excursions and exciting trips away and things like Goodwood. As long as you've got a stable foundation in your life, you won't get too unsettled by it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All right, our next question: is there any advice you give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster?
Yeah. Enjoy making mistakes, enjoy failing. Engineering is not a series of right answers. The P40 is absolutely demonstrably not a series of right answers. It's a series of trials, and you learn a lot more from fucking things up than you do from getting them right. Because actually, for example, the handling on the P40 is good, and a sort of don't know why. I do know why, but I don't know why it's as good as it is. And I think a lot of people would be lying if they said they did. So the whole process of being young is about finding your way. It's about taking some risks and doing some stuff while you still can. I was quite risk averse. And again, on the academic thing, it might not sound too glamorous, but focus on the things that you can't do as much as the things you can do, right?
Yeah, I think that was something I picked up from the chat we've had, is that focus. I mean, I probably am exactly the same. You naturally gravitate towards the things that you're good at because they're easy and you enjoy doing them, and you kind of do the old ostrich effect and put your head in the sand when it comes to the hard things. But yeah, I mean, if you ignore them, clearly you're never going to get better at them. So I think while it's not maybe enjoyable at the time, that's the part that's really going to make a difference.
Exactly. I mean, rest assured that if you are listening to this and you are young, whiskey never starts to taste nice, and you're never going to want to get up early in the morning, and you're never going to want to wash dishes and cook and do all that stuff. But it is an intrinsic part of a balanced life, and if you can get good at the little stuff, the big stuff can follow from it.
I mean, I think the other point I'll pull back out of our discussion, though, as well, is it seemed to me from what you've explained that a turning point in your life was really the people that you surrounded yourself around, and actually deciding to take things a bit more seriously.
Yeah, 100%. Get influenced. Get in with people your own age, people a bit older, whatever, who pull you in the right direction, who call you out for your bullshit. And a lot of my best friends enduring have been we have quite honest dialogue about status and where we're going, particularly whether it's the car or whatever. So don't be afraid of bad news. Don't be afraid of being insulted by things that people say about how you're doing. If you design a car and you're the only person in your year who designs a car, and someone says, "Oh, that looks like shit," you go back to them and go, "Well, what does yours look like?"
Exactly.
You don't go, "Oh, I'm going to go home and cry," and that will be the end of it. But just ignore it. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but you can't. The bad voices will always be louder than the good. That's an unfortunate fact of life.
Yes, there's definitely sort of a bit of tall poppy syndrome out there across the world. I think social media has made that worse because we can be critical while being anonymous, and a lot of the comments you see online, I'm like, there is absolutely no way you would say that comment to the person's face if you're standing in front of them, because you'd probably get decked. But you do need to sort of grow a reasonably thick skin if you're putting yourself out there on social media, and I absolutely can attest to that personally as well.
For sure. Yeah.
All right, last question for today, Alex. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, and I highly recommend that our listeners do so, how are they best to do this? Where are you at online?
So I do all of my stuff at the moment on Instagram. My handle is Alex_Summers_hillclimb. I have a YouTube channel which is basically just onboards. I will one day get to doing stuff. It has the same handle. I do intend one day to do longer build stuff, but I don't at the moment. And I'm dabbling with TikTok, but TikTok makes me feel very old.
Me too.
So that's a very fledgling account. So at the moment, really, it's Instagram. That's where I'm most active and most involved. Likewise, McMurtry Automotive are very active on Instagram. And between me, Max Chilton, and McMurtry, we do quite a lot of collaborative content and in-depth content, and also just cool stuff like onboards and flybys. So I would say Instagram, and that's where I'm my most comfortable.
Well, as usual, people will find those links in the show notes to make it easy for everyone to find. Look, Alex, it's been an amazing conversation. Really enjoyed the chat and getting that in-depth understanding of your background, and maybe a more rounded understanding of what that British Hill Climb Championship actually entails. Certainly, it's at another level to anything we have here in New Zealand. We also obviously wish you all the best with claiming at least another championship. So we'll look forward to seeing how you progress.
No, thank you very much. It's always lovely to talk to other engineers. And for anyone listening, I've been watching these guys on HP Academy, things like Motec, dyno work and tuning and various videos, engine builds and stuff. So, I was hugely honoured and privileged when you messaged to say to have a chat. So it's been a great experience. And hopefully if people have learned something, that would be a really nice side benefit from that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the feedback, and yeah, it's always the case. Hopefully someone has learned something from the chat. All right, we'll leave you to go. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, mate. Cheers.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Alex Summers, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Tug from Great Britain, who has said, "Never stop learning. Andre keeps delivering fantastic interviews with a wide range of people with various backgrounds, but all now successful in the high-performance automotive industry. It's great how I keep learning new things from different points of view each time." Well, thanks for the kind words. Great to hear that you're finding value in the podcast. And if you get in touch with your shipping details and t-shirt size, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.